The next one here, very cool one, is actually called giant cell arteritis or temporal arteritis. So if someone has what's called giant cell arteritis, also known as temporal arteritis. So with this one, you definitely present with a headache, but it's usually over the temporal region, thus the name temporal arteritis. It's usually due to the inflammation or vascularity of that vessel, the superficial temporal artery. What happens is, you know what's interesting? Another thing that you can see in the vignettes is that someone will say, oh man, I have this pain in this area of my temple. It's causing a headache, but it's so tender that even when I brush my hair, it's so painful. That's kind of a telltale sign on the exams. The other thing to think about is if they have any claudications. What does that mean? They have kind of like pain, or they have kind of like they get really fatigued within the muscles of their chewing muscles, the mastication muscles, because that blood coming from that area, the external carotid artery, can also kind of get a little vasculitic that supplies the temporal artery. And if that gets vasculitic, it can affect the blood flow to the mastication muscles, and they can get fatigued or tired or painful during chewing. So this is called jaw claudication. The other thing is the vasculitis can extend into what's called the ophthalmic artery, and this can even lead to visual changes. So potentially visual changes, sometimes with the worst case scenario, if not corrected very, very quickly, can lead to blindness. And one last thing to think about here is that it's commonly associated with a very particular condition called polymyalgia rheumatica. Polymyalgia rheumatica is when you have this kind of like muscle tenderness and pain of like the proximal upper extremities and the proximal lower extremities. Very, very commonly associated. I think this is a good thing to talk about diagnosis though. How do you diagnose this condition? You can actually check an ESR and a CRP, and they're often elevated because of the inflammation, but the gold standard is what's called a temporal artery biopsy. So I think this is one of those types of tests that you'll definitely want to remember for your exam, okay? All right, the last type of secondary headache that is kind of an external one that I want you guys to think about, very, very important one to remember here, is going to be trigeminal neuralgia. This is a very, very sad type of